everybody, here's a question for you. Have you ever tried back button focus? Well, I have to say I have at least twice, and on both occasions after trying it extensively, I've gone back to my original way of shooting. Now that's not to say that back button focus is wrong or it's a method that doesn't work. For a lot of people it's absolutely fantastic and you can do a great job with it. It's just I think that different people work quite differently and their brains potentially work quite differently and process things differently. So what happens is something that's become universally accepted as the way to do it is not necessarily the way. And in this video I thought I'd just take you through my method that I've developed rather than using back button focus. And for those of you out there who maybe struggle with back button focus and have tried it like me several times and can't get on with it, this may just be a solution. So let's get on with it. Right, so I suppose if we're going to discuss an alternative to back button focus, we ought to really look at what back button focus is and how it operates. So I'll just demonstrate. If I was using back button focus on this camera, what I would have is my shutter button, which normally what that does, it has two functions. You press it down halfway and it focuses the camera. So if I'm tracking a bird in flight, I would have it on continuous focus because I want to continually refocus because the bird's moving. So I'm doing that and I'm tracking the bird. I'm pressing the shutter all the way down to take shots as I'm focusing. Then the bird comes to a stop and lands on a post in front of me. Fantastic shot, I can't wait to get it. So normally what happens is I would take the picture of the bird on the post, but what happens if that bird isn't in the position I want? What happens if I've got a lovely vista to the left of it and the bird's looking to the left and I want to include that in the picture? Well, if your camera's set up like mine is, what happens is I focus on the bird, I reposition the shot so the bird's off to the right, I press the button, the shutter button down, the camera refocuses on the background, the bird's out of focus. So in essence what back button focus does is it removes the function of focusing from your shutter button and changes it to a button on the back which you can allocate. So most cameras now, all the buttons are customizable, so you can switch them about and make them do whatever you want to a certain extent. And what has been developed is a way that what you do is, in this instance, same situation, I've got a bird flying across. This time I'm focusing using the AEL button on the back. So that's focusing, I'm taking shots, pressing the shutter button. Now the bird comes to a stop on this post in front of me. So I focus with the back button, the AEL button. I take my finger off that, I move the camera to reposition the shot, take a shot, and the camera hasn't automatically focused on the background because there's no longer a focusing function allocated to the shutter button. And that in the essence is one of the reasons why back button focus has become very popular, because it allows you to do that. So this is where I started with my problems with back button focus, because what I was finding is that conservatively 80% of the time, probably more like 90% of the time, back button focus was no use to me whatsoever. In that situation that I've just showed you, where the bird lands on the post, most of the time, especially with wildlife, I was finding that I was cropping the image. So, the bird was not significantly big enough in the frame that I wanted to make it bigger, so I was going to make a small crop. So with my Sony a6400, what that meant was that I could probably crop 25% of the image. Now, as you see from this buzzard image here, what happens then is if you're cropping the image, it doesn't matter if the bird has been photographed in the middle of the frame. Your actual crop, you can move your crop around so that you can position the bird in a more favourable position anyway. So why did I need back button focus for that? The other thing is for me, is if I'm only using it a very small amount of the time, why would I change my whole shooting method for just a small percentage of time? It just didn't seem to make sense to me. And I suppose in a way, you can look at the manufacturers. Can you tell me a manufacturer like Sony, Canon, Nikon, Olympus, anybody who's removed the shutter button and focusing button, split it into two and had a separate focusing button on the back as standard and basically now your shutter button, you have to set it up to focus as like an option. As far as I'm aware, nobody's done it, and the reason they haven't done it, presumably, is because they know that 80% of the time, back button focus doesn't really come into the equation. So, as I say, this is not a bash back button focus video. A lot of people it works really well for, a huge amount of people it works really well for, and it does, that's fantastic. But for me, it just seemed a little bit illogical for that small amount of time. But then I did have occasions where, you know, back button focus would have been useful. So I came up with something that works in my mind much better, and I'm going to explain that situation to you now. Right, so what is my alternative to back button focus? Well, I wanted to use something simple that, because, as I say, 80% of the time back button focus, you know, I'm not using it anyway, I don't require it. So I just wanted something simple that achieves the same thing for that type of shot that we've been looking at. Now, one of the things that this Sony 200-600 lens has got on it is these buttons that you can customize. Now, bear with me if your lens doesn't have these, there's a solution to that as well. But what I've done is basically set these up to toggle between manual and autofocus. So for me, how this works, if we take that same scenario, focusing and taking shots are on the shutter button. So I'm tracking that bird in front of me, it lands on that post, but I want to reposition the shot. As we've said, I can't press the shutter button when I move off because it'll focus on the background. So I immediately focus on the bird on the post by pressing the shutter button halfway down. Then I hit one of my buttons on my lens, which is under my thumb here, look. I'm now in manual focus, so this camera will not autofocus unless I switch it back or I move the focus ring, which I'm not going to do. I then reposition the shot slightly to where I want it and then take the shot using the shutter button as I normally would. And that's basically it. So it's a simple solution that I can just use really quickly. Now, one of the things some people have said to me is they're always catching the buttons on the lens, they catch them quite easily and they've switched them off altogether. But for me, I just know if it's not focusing, that's what it is, and I'll just tap the button. You do have to be a little bit more careful. There is a solution to that though, and especially if you don't have a lens that's got these buttons on it. If you look on the back of this Sony camera, there's an AF on button, pretty much across from what most people use for their back button focus button, the AEL button. And again, same thing, tracking it, shooting, taking images, focusing and refocusing, lands on the post, focus on the bird, hit the AF on button or AF off button as it is, refocus my shot, take the shot, autofocus back on. And it's as simple as that. And that, you know, for me works really well for that small percentage of shots where, you know, I need to position the animal in the viewfinder and recompose the shot. Now, I'd be really interested to see if anybody else has come around any sort of workarounds that they use for this situation. As I say, I think that the issue is that we all work slightly differently, and people's brains do process things slightly differently. And what can seem common sense to one person seems like utter claptrap to somebody else. And as I say, this is not a video where I want to say you must do this, you know, this will change your photography life. And I have seen videos for back button focus that say that, which yeah, I find quite funny really, but there is obviously marketing hype. But for me, you know, the biggest thing is if the manufacturers haven't switched over to doing that with their cameras, there must be a reason why. And you know, that makes the most sense to me. As I say, this works for me, it might not work for you. It's just an easy, quick solution for me that works for those occasions when I need to use it. And the rest of the time I just shoot as normal, and I'm quite happy doing that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's given you a little bit of food for thought. This is a solution you might want to try if you've struggled with back button focus. And as I say, yeah, if it helps somebody out, then that's great. Anyway, I will see you next week for another video. As always, if you've enjoyed this one, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you next week for some more wildlife photography. Bye.